Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to see so many of your faces and names on the screen here with us today. I can see folks are getting their audio connected, and we've got just about a minute before the top of the hour. So we'll give you a minute to get settled, get ready for your APR webinar. All right. Well, we won't waste a minute here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to say hello to your fellow professional development program grantees in the chat box while I get started. Welcome to the kickoff of the annual performance reporting season. This is the Professional Development Program Annual Performance Webinar. I'm going to get us started with our standard disclaimer.
This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred.
All right. Now that we've got that out of the way, welcome everybody. My name is Tracy Madej Carragher. I am a member of your Office of Indian Education Technical Assistance team. I'll be your primary facilitator today. I'm joined by my colleagues also on the technical assistance team who are helping to monitor the chat box and making sure everyone's getting the technical support that they need. We're also joined today by your program officer, Ms. Angela Hernandez.
Welcome, everybody. I'm glad you could make it, and look forward to walking through this with you today. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. So just before we get started, a couple housekeeping tips. I think most of this stuff you folks already know, that we are recording today, so that if we're going through something and you want to revisit it later, we will have the recording posted on our YouTube channel, our technical assistance YouTube channel, where you can watch it, as our colleague likes to say, Netflix style, where you can watch it, stop it, pause it, rewind as you need. So also for that reason, if you're not talking, we ask that you keep your line on mute. That'll help keep the audio clear for everyone to understand. We will pause periodically as we go through our webinar today and provide information. We'll pause to take questions, but please also feel free to use that chat box. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll try to answer some of your questions as we go along. And then, like I said, of course, pausing to take questions as well. All right. Oh, and we invite you, I know sometimes technology or circumstances doesn't allow audio, but if you do come off mute to chat with us, we just invite you to join us on video camera as well. It's always nice to see your face. Here's an overview of our topics and flow for today. We'll go over in detail the reporting requirements for both cohorts of professional development grantees. Those of you who are operating 2018 grants made in fiscal year 2018, as well as those of you who were just awarded grants in 2021. We're going to cover all parts of the annual performance reporting forms, and we're going to provide some examples today. So just a heads up, you might see some good examples from your fellow colleagues on the screen in a little later on. So first thing we're going to put in front of you today is a reminder that if you don't have these dates on your calendar, you may want to go ahead and put a hold on your calendar for these due dates. Maybe even a few reminders back mapping between now and then to set aside some time to gather your information and needed signatures so that we're not scrambling for those at the end. I know some of you have already started compiling information for your APR reports. So on the screen, I'll just read it so that we all get that information. 2018 grantees, your annual performance reports are due March 31st of this year. at 4:30 p.m. That's Eastern time. So just note that that might be earlier in your day. That is Eastern time. For 2021 grantees, your due date is April 29th of this year, also at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. Keeping in mind that G5 is really, really strict with time deadlines, and the system will close precisely at that 4:30 mark Eastern time, and you won't be able to get in there to enter in any information. So just a heads up about that. Before we get into some details about each of the sections here, we wanted to lift up a little bit about the purpose behind your annual performance reports. And I think, Angela, did you have a few words to share about that?
Sure. So this is just a reminder for most of you, but some of you are new to this process and to this work. And so we will be going through every piece of this element today. And it's really a reminder that the annual performance report is a required report per the department requirements under our General Administrative Regulations, or EDGAR, as we refer to it, that any grantee with multi-year grants must submit an APR in order to demonstrate that you are making substantial progress toward meeting the approved project objectives. The approved project objectives are basically what you said you were going to do in your grant application. The Office of Indian Education reviews your APR. We, in turn, make recommendations to the Secretary of Education for approval for, in this case, for both cohorts, non-competitive continuation awards. Of course, it's to award that next year's funding, year 2, for our Fy21 grantees, and the final year or 5th year for our Fy18 grantees. Next slide. So I just want to review, because there is a very fundamental change for those of you who've been doing this work and this APR population over the last few years. Over the last few years, we've required to essentially ask you to report both all of the elements that result in indicators for our Gebra measures. And those 6 Gebra measures I'll go through in just a second, mostly through the PDP DCS, or the Professional Development Program Data Collection System. We generate the aggregate figures and outcomes based on what you input in the DCS. So when we're asking you to report it in the 524, 2 things happen. One is, as I go through this, you're going to see most of these are sort of the final outcomes, right, of your projects, meaning that up to the first 4 years of your respective grants, you could be entering 999 because the data is not complete. You have people that are still in the training, in the preparatory portion of the work, as opposed to already being placed. So this year, we've made a change and said, we're going to just ask you to continue to report like we always do. And we've had separate training and discussions about what is due in the DCS in early April. And we'll get to that in a second. But that will be separate and not required for you to report in what we call Section A, and we'll go over in just a bit in the Ed 524. But I do want to just call to your attention the Gebra measures and just remind you that we have 6. The first is the administrator Gebra indicator, which is the percentage of participants in administrator prep programs who become principals, vice principals, et cetera, right? Then the second is the teachers, the comparable, the percentage of participants in teacher preparation projects who become teachers. Then the third is licensure. The 4th is the percent who complete the service payback obligation portion. And then ultimately the averaging of the costs for each of those participants in your program, in your respective programs. And so again, most of these, as you can tell, are things that are really those long-term outcomes, as opposed to really being able to judge year to year, meaning years 1 to 5, what your progress is, because the first 4 years, if these are our only milestones, it'll be hard to measure that, right? Let's go to the next item. So instead, what we want you to focus on are what you described and talked about as the project measures in the PD application. So when you applied, you recall there were 4 items, 4 measures that you had to describe and project for your respective programs. One was the number of participants to be recruited each year for your program. 2, the number of participants to continue each year. 3, the number of participants to graduate each year. And then 4, the number of participants to find qualifying employment within 12 months of completion. So again, as you can tell, of course, just sort of as a milestone, these are much more just-in-time measures to be able to assess that progress, right? So we'll focus on you completing the Ed 524 based on both these measures and what we call project-specific measures, and we'll get to that in just a bit. Let's go to the next slide. So again, these are those same project measures I just mentioned. And I mentioned this particularly for some of you who are new project directors and may need to go back to that original application so you can be really clear about what you guys entered, what your institution or organization entered in those projected numbers for each year, because you'll be expected to enter the targets, meaning what you said you would do, as well as the actual of really at this point in time, what have you done? Okay, next slide. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Tracy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that heads up. So we will come back to those and get into that even more specifically in the coming slides. But to start off, I wanted to make sure that you got to see that this is the landing page for that G5 system where you will submit your annual performance report. So a couple of important pieces of information you can find on this landing page are that you want to be aware of is the scheduling. Sometimes G5 does close for maintenance or for updates. So you might want to take a peek at that just to make sure you know when it's going to be closed. So you're not trying to enter in data or finalize a report when there happens to be some maintenance going on. The other thing we'll point out there is in that blue shaded box there in the lower left corner. That is the contact information for the help desk if you should need any help. You'll note that all these times are again in Eastern time. The standard hours of operation for that help desk are from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Eastern time, with the exception of federal holidays when they are not available. There's a couple of different ways you can get a hold of them. You can email them, you can call them directly, and they'll be able to help you with that system. Should you have any questions or issues there. You will be using for your annual performance report or your APR, you will be using the ED 524 reporting forms. If you've submitted an APR in the past, this form will look very familiar to you. One thing you'll want to be sure if you have something on file already, and I know Olani is going to post our current forms in there, just double check that expiration date in the upper right-hand corner there. As of today, it should read, your current form should read 7/31/2024. So if you're unsure if you have that up-to-date form on file, you can download it now from the chat box. We also have the link there to G5 where you can also find those forms from the link on the screen. I encourage you, if you want to download those forms and follow along as we move through today's webinar, you can make some notes on those pages for yourself to come back to. You can also revisit this recording and pause and play and fast forward as you need in case you need to revisit any of the information or tips that we shared today. We're going to walk through each of the required sections. We'll go over the cover sheet, the executive summary, sections A, B, and C, and highlight some of those particulars that make this professional development grant reporting a little bit unique. Okay. So let's go ahead and get into it now. What you're looking at on the screen right now is a screenshot of the cover sheet, and you will need a new cover sheet for your annual performance report. Again, making sure you have the most up-to-date form. Couple of things that we want to highlight up here. Number one is item number 1. This is where you're going to enter in your unique PR number that is specific to your grant. Make sure you include that full number. Okay, and make sure you have the correct number too, especially if you're operating multiple grants, whether you have multiple PD grants or maybe you have other OIE grants that your organization works with as well. The next item I'll bring to your attention is item number 7. You want to make this is about the reporting period, and you see on the screen there the specific reporting periods for both the fiscal year 18 grantees and the fiscal year 2021 grantees. This will appear on the screen several times throughout our session today, so definitely you want to make note of those reporting periods. You'll be reporting for fiscal year 18. You'll be reporting on the current project year, which is October 1st, 21, so October 1 of last year to March 1 of this year. For fiscal year 2021 grantees, your reporting period is a little bit different. Your current reporting period is August 3rd of last year to April 1 of this year. Okay. Next, I'm going to highlight item number 8. And item number 8 is about the budget, and here is where you're going to enter in some numbers. For items for your annual report, for this report, you're going to leave lines 8A and 8C blank. Those are not used at this time. However, line B, as in boy, is this single current budget period that corresponds with the budget period that I just read over. So you're going to enter into that line the amount of dollars that you've actually spent or obligated and drawn down. Okay, and that should match what has been drawn in G5 as of the reporting period end date, either March 1st or April 1st, depending on which cohort you belong to. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And please do feel free to pose any questions.
I have a question. Is it obligated and drawn down, not or?
You're talking about on 8B?
Yes.
You want everything.
Yeah.
Obligated and drawn down.
Okay.
So this, and Trace is going to get into this because as you guys know, the rate of drawdowns from G5 is not matching your spending typically. And this is where, the learning curve, I know for some of our project directors occurs because we're asking you to be tracking, even though your budget office might not be, liquidating, right, at the pace that you're spending.
It might be helpful to think of this cover sheet as sort of the summary, right? Like this is just a quick glance at what you're reporting on, and we'll get into a little bit more details when we get to section B about the budget. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Next, I want to highlight item number 9. And this is about indirect costs. So you'll just want to be sure that you're entering in the most up-to-date indirect cost information. We know that sometimes those rates expire, or maybe other details change when they get renewed. So good idea just to double check to make sure that you're including the most up-to-date information here, and please don't skip it. Please don't leave this blank. Item number 10 is just an X. You see down there in the lower portion of your screen. This item asks about human subjects and institutional review board requirements. Everybody will check not applicable for that item number 10. On the other hand, item number 11, which is last on this page, but very important to check yes. This one is about data privacy and security measures. So not only will everybody click yes for item number 11, but you'll also include that corresponding policy in your section C as evidence that those securities are in place. Here is the back of the cover sheet, or page 2 of your cover sheet. Couple important details to note here. First one, and we're going to unpack this one just a little bit, is item number 12, which is about your performance measure status. So you're going to indicate in this form here either yes, that all of your data is available and is included in this annual performance report, or you will click no, that your data is not currently available, but it will be available in the not too distant future. And if you click no, you'll need to include the date for which you expect your data to be available. Let's take a look at a couple examples for this. So on the screen is a scenario, and the question for you is, should the grantee indicate yes or no for item number 12 on the cover sheet? And you can pop your responses into the chat box. So knowing that your reporting due dates are either March 31st or April 29th, what would be the appropriate response here? The project measure is that 10 participants will find qualifying jobs within 12 months of completion. This is the first year of the grant, and participants graduate in May of 2022. So later May of this year. I see some responses coming in. Give everyone a chance to reply. All right, you are correct. The correct answer is no. You would check no on the cover sheet because that data will be available in spring of 2023, and you'd want to indicate that date on your cover sheet. All right, everyone gets a gold star. Good job.
Tracy,
one more. Oh,
let
yeah.
me say one more thing quickly about this. Just an FYI, folks, you know, when it says when will the data be available, in just as sticking with this example, if what you really just needed was that information on graduation, and that was all that was keeping your APR from being complete, you would say no. And you really have the choice of either saying, well, it'll be ready after that graduation date. But frankly, I would much prefer for you to put the date that you're likely to put in the data in the DCS about graduations. Does that make sense to folks? So just making sure that often, right, there's that gap between when they actually graduate, their graduation date, and the time that you put in that data in the DCS. So I would prefer that you enter that date of the date you're going to put the data in the DCS, i.e. exit them with completion, ideally, right? So just keep that in mind, as that would be the date that you'd be entering in this example. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. Good to give yourself that time and space to get the data and then actually enter it in. All right, here's a little bit of a different scenario, but same question. What should the grantee enter into the cover sheet for this scenario? Again, given your reporting due dates of March 31st and April 29th, what would be the appropriate response? In this case, the measure is that 90% of participants will continue in the project year. Your semester ends in May of this year, and you know that hiring decisions about participants working in a qualified location probably may not be made till June or perhaps even later. What would be the appropriate response? So we've got some responses coming in. Give you all some think time. Yes or no? Well, we said the correct answer would be no, because we won't know about all the participants' continuation until probably sometime that summer of that year. I'm going to pause now, maybe for some questions. I do see that we have a hand up.
So Lacey, did you have a question? Or that might have been up. That might have been up from earlier.
I think it was an old hand. But I mean, I thought it is. I mean, you would be able to answer. You would have the measurements already for recruitment. That would have already been clear. And then continuing would be no, graduating would be no, and number 4 would be no, right?
That's right, but you have one entry. So
Okay.
it's not parsing it, it's just on the whole, right? So if there's even one element of outstanding data, and it's a good question, you're writing no, because even for that one element, you're waiting for that complete data.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still looking at that cover sheet there, which is really supposed to be just like a quick glance of what's going to be contained in the full report. And actually we'll come back to this idea too about when data is available and what to report. That'll be a little bit more nuanced.
Thanks.
All right, so turning back now to that cover sheet. Another very important item, you want to make sure that you have the signature of your authorized representative included on that cover sheet. Good idea always to get on their radar ahead of time so that they know to expect the form and that their signature is needed, and you don't get caught, with them maybe being out of the office or just unavailable to sign the form, and they have the opportunity to ask any questions if that's the case. So remember now that with the cover sheet has a little bit of a different process. You can actually go into G5 and enter your information, and that'll enter in all that information into that nice cover sheet and put it into the form. Then you're going to download that completed form and take that physical hard copy to your authorized representative to have them sign it. So once you get them, once they get it signed, then you can upload that completed signed form into G5. And sometimes I know G5 can be quirky. If you have any troubles uploading that cover sheet into G5, and it will work better if it's a PDF. But if you do have troubles, you can reach out to us or your program officer, Angela Hernandez. Okay. All right, so that's some important items there on the cover sheet to be aware of. The other piece of that, the forms there that we want to lift up are the executive summary. So you'll have 1 to 2 pages for the executive summary, where you'll be able to provide a narrative description of your program's accomplishments and highlights. So you want to think about, your project goals, your intended outcomes. Take this space to describe the extent to which your program was able to accomplish those goals, or if not, and sometimes things happen, but provide a brief rationale as to why those goals weren't met. Include any lessons learned or insights as you were working towards those goals. That's valuable information to lift up in your executive summary. Maybe you were able to overcome a challenge. That's something to mention and lift up here. Or maybe you were able to accomplish your goals in a different way. Again, important details to include in your executive summary. If your project goals or objectives were not met, just provide in your summary some information about those challenges and what impacted that project implementation in that regard. So, you know, a common challenge that we often see in programs is, you know, if there's turnover with project directors, which may be the case for some of you, or maybe there were delays in hiring that prevented, you know, forward movement. Those are things you'll want to mention in your executive summary. Lastly, in your executive summary, OIE wants to know about some broader contributions that your project has made to research, knowledge, practice, or policy, things that you may have learned from your program, from program implementation, evaluation, maybe trends in your data that you've documented along the way. Quick tip from your technical assistance team about developing your executive summary. If you're a veteran at this, then you know this and you can attest to this fact. But our advice is that you develop this executive summary in another document outside of G5 before you actually upload it into your APR. This does a couple of things. One is that G5 is programmed to automatically time out, and it'll do that even if you're in the system and clicking around. So be sure to save your work, and B, take the time, give yourself the gift of time and less pressure to develop your executive summary outside the system, so that you won't accidentally lose some of your work when G5 times out. I'm going to pause for any questions that we might have gathered in the chat box or that might be on your mind before we move on to the next section of the APR report. Okay, I do see some chat going on in the chat box, so hopefully we're getting questions answered there. Let's move on now to section A, the project status chart. You'll see the tables on the screen as they will actually appear in G5. Section A, this contains the bulk of information that you submit in your annual performance report. The purpose of this chart is really to demonstrate with data and a little bit of narrative the progress that your project is making towards those approved objectives from your grant application. So here's a little peek at that project status chart and some important features here. Bearing in mind that we're entering only those project measures, both the required ones that Angela lifted up a little bit earlier, as well as any that are unique and specific that you've defined for your program. Those will be labeled in G5 as PROJ. So in that measure type where you see that red round circle right now, you'll have the option to choose either Gebra, which we're not entering here, or project. You're going to enter in project. And just a reminder too, because this might be a little bit different if you have other OIE grants, you're going to enter in both the target and actual numbers for that measure. And the example on there is a target and actual number of induction activities conducted each year. That might be an example of a measure that may be included. Just a quick glance back at those required project measures that everyone's defined. You may have some additional unique project measures that are specific to your program. Just a reminder here too, the Gebra data, that's captured in the PDCS and you can refer to the reporting guidance for that, but we're not entering your Gebra data into G5, okay? That's a nuance that makes reporting for your project or for your professional development grants a little bit unique. You see the current reporting periods on the screen there. Again, just as a reminder. And your APR data should be reported for the project objectives for this current implementation year. Again, corresponding to those dates that you see on the screen. So this is where we're going to get into a little bit more nuance around whether or not your data is available for reporting. So we've alluded to it earlier that data that are unavailable now, but will be before the end of the project year, should be noted with a 999 in your project status chart. Zeros are only reported for a measure if that data will not exist for this project year. So for instance, perhaps a grantee has a project measure related to school day attendance, but during COVID, the schools weren't taking attendance, and so in that case, the appropriate data to report is 0. So if we do report a 0, or if you report a 999, you want to include a little explanation in your explanation of progress about why that is the case. And we'll dig into this a little bit further as well. So here again is a look at that project status chart and how it might look when it's actually filled out. Your project status data corresponds to the scope and objectives that you established in that original grant application, as well as any approved amendments. You must report on all your project measures data, and bear in mind too, if you've reported on this project previously, you're going to use the same exact wording that you used in your previous APRs. So we're not changing any wording related to our project measures. You're going to enter in the quantitative data that's up here in the table part right here. You're going to label them as PROJ, project measures, enter in that raw number for both the target and the actual. Okay. And you're going to do that for all of your required as well as your unique project measures. Here's a screenshot of what that might look like when it's actually entered. So we have two examples on the screen here. So this is an update that I'm hoping that you'll like. Angela has pre-populated your APR reports in G5 so that those required project measures that we've mentioned a few times will be pre-populated, and they will appear at the top of the screen there above that quantitative data table. Okay, so
Tracy, I'm going to add there that unlike this example that you're seeing here, where we plopped in that green font language, the actual section A form that is pre-populated, the project measure is listed there, but it's very tiny, just like the rest of the type on the page. So you kind of have to pay attention to make sure that you're answering and responding to the correct measure. So just a note on that's what I could tell anyway, from looking at that. So yeah, Maria, I think we kind of figured out how to do some of that pre-populating, at least for those that we require, right? Versus your project specific measures. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you. And we've made it, big and bold and put a big red box around it. But just know that when you get into G5, you want to be sure to look at the top of the screen there, at the top of that table chart there, to see which of the measures that it's asking for. It'll hopefully avoid any confusion and hopefully make it a little bit easier for you as well. Okay. The second example there, this is meant to be an example of something that was unique or specific to your project. for those, you'll be able to enter in that text right there where you see that big red box, right? In this case, our example is that the professional development project will conduct twice monthly induction service activities, August through June. Again, labeling it appropriately, then entering in that raw number. In this case, twice monthly, August through June, that raw number would be 22. And in this case, in our example, this grantee has completed about half of those. So the raw number is 11. Oh, there we go. Oh, sorry, I had a little bit more emphasis there. The raw numbers in both the target and the actual. Okay, and then the explanation of progress is where you're going to provide details that help explain those numbers, what you're measuring, how you're collecting the data, and why they are what they are currently. And we actually have some examples that we'll share here in a little bit around those explanations of progress, so you can get an idea of what you may need to include there. Okay. So we talked about sometimes your data isn't available. And we talked about what you need to enter into the cover sheet, either a yes or no. If it's no, you're going to give us a date. Now in section A is when we get a little bit more nuanced about that data that's not yet available. So we have a scenario, you've seen this one before. In this case, we're not asking yes or no, we're asking what should this grantee report into their section A project status chart? Is it a 0 or is it a 999? The project measure is that 10 participants will find qualifying jobs within 12 months. This is the first year of their grant, and participants graduate in May of this year. So are we putting in 0 or 999? I see we've got some answers rolling in. Okay, we've got maybe some different ideas about what we need to put here. Give you a little bit more think time. All right, and the big reveal, correct answer is 0. Okay, because the data about those graduates won't actually exist. We won't know if they've all gotten qualifying jobs within that 12-month of completion after graduation. So the data is really not going to be available for this current project year. It will be available in the future, just not this project year. So that's a 0. The correct answer is 0. Okay, how about another one? All right, little bit different scenario in this case. Same question, should the grantee indicate 999 or 0 in that project status chart? In this case, the project measure is that 100% of project participants will pass the process exams by May 1st, 2022, this year. Some more folks typing in. We got a lot of 999s coming in. Correct. If you thought 999, yes, that is the correct answer. The data is not available by the time your APR is due, but it will be available before the end of the grant year. So that's a 999. All right. One more scenario here, just for a little extra practice. Okay, same question. Do we report 999 or 0? Here's the project measure. All participants completing 1 year of induction will demonstrate growth through pre and post assessments of self-efficacy related to culturally responsive teaching using the culturally responsive teaching self-efficacy scale. What are we reporting? 0 or 999? some zeros. Okay. Give you all a little bit more think time. Okay, if you typed or are thinking 0, then you are correct. That data in that project measure won't be available within this current project year. It will be in the future, probably near the end of the grant, based on the wording of that scenario, or excuse me, that project measure scenario. Okay, I'm going to pause for some questions. I think we have a couple questions in the chat box.
Thanks, Tracy. So one question we got, thank you for that question, Leilani, is what if we put in 999 when it should have been 0, or vice versa, right? I'll say, I promise G5 will not implode. No, nobody will automatically lose funding, nothing horrible. However, 2 things to think about. One is, I guess a question I'd have back is when, right? So if you identify that you entered something wrong and submitted the APR, as long as it's before the due date, you should be able to resubmit within G5. If it's after the due date, which I'm going to say, and let's use this scenario that it's more likely, and it's me who identifies that this was an error in review of your APR, I would likely be reaching out to you and asking you and kind of just clarifying. And if it was an error, have you resubmit that page to me directly via email, which is typically how I have to do corrections to anything that I'm dealing with. And it's usually I'm dealing with it after the due date for obvious reasons. I'm having to take care of that manually. But good question. Thank you. I think that's all I see, unless something else just popped up. Yeah, I think we're okay, Tracy.
There we go. All right, thank you. Yes, please keep using that chat box. We will keep going, but that is not the last opportunity you have to ask questions. All right, so just a few more details about the explanation of progress. That's the narrative part. You get a little space. It is limited, but you get a little space to provide some text to explain what's happening in the quantitative data in your project status chart. So when you're writing your explanation of progress, you'll want to provide some qualitative, perhaps some more quantitative information that gives the reader insight about whether or not your goals, your targets are being met. Give us a little bit of insight about the background or the context under which you're operating, as well as maybe any challenges that you overcame to make progress in those areas. In the narrative explanation of progress, you want to demonstrate how you have met or made progress towards the goal. If you've not met it, just provide an explanation of why. This is where you're going to describe what those numbers are measuring. Sometimes it's really easy to tell. Sometimes you need to make it easy on your reader or reviewer and help them understand what those numbers are representing. We also ask that you include information about how you collect that data to report on those measures, the frequency of your data tracking or collection, and describe any measurement tools that you used, and perhaps even include that data collection window. You can describe in that explanation of progress any evaluation methods, how you analyze that data to make that determination about your target and actual numbers. So you want to briefly describe those activities and accomplishments. The information that you enter into that explanation of progress in section A, it really should be different than what you include in the executive summary. Whereas the executive summary is a bit more of an overview with some highlights and challenges that you've overcome or are working to overcome. this drills down a little bit more specifically into that data that you've entered into that project status chart. Here's some things. We're gonna spend a little bit of time looking at this now, this section A and the explanation of progress, because this is a really valuable space, and we do read these, right? I promise you're not reporting into a black hole. There are people on the other end that do read these and do look at them and do read your information. So here's some look fors or some tips when you're developing your explanation of progress. Provide some details about that reported quantitative data in the table. Like I said, sometimes it's really helpful to state clearly for your reviewer what those numbers represent. Sometimes it can be helpful. Do they represent people? Do they represent events? Sometimes it's really obvious the way it's worded, but other times it's not so obvious. The explanation text and that explanation of progress should really be clearly linked to each listed measure. It's helpful, not to make your reviewer guess which measure is being discussed in that narrative piece of the chart. And then one final detail that we often find is overlooked in reporting is that the form asks for details about how the data is collected, how it's compiled for reporting. So be sure to include a few sentences in there that address how you're collecting and compiling that data. And we have actually now some examples of explanations of progress. And I'm going to ask that you keep these look fors in mind, providing details about the numbers, making sure that that narrative piece is clearly linked to the measures that appear in the table, and then explaining how data is collected and compiled for reporting. So I'm going to put on the screen here an actual sample from one of your PD colleagues. And I'm going to invite you to just read this explanation of progress, and maybe type into the chat examples of those look fors. Is it clearly linked to the measure? Is it telling us how data is compiled and collected? Is it describing what those numbers are measuring? If you're feeling really adventurous, you can use the annotation tools and actually make a mark on the screen and underline some of that text. You can find those annotation tools if you look at the top of your screen. It's going to say viewing Tracy's screen, and then right next to that there'll be a drop-down menu. And if you click that drop-down menu, you'll see an option to annotate. You can actually choose the draw tool. You can make some underlines. I think I'm checking here. Yes, using that same draw tool, you could also draw a little square around some text. But I'm going to be quiet and give you a moment to read and lift up some text that you see addresses those look fors. I see folks are finding the annotation tools. I just love seeing that. Okay, so I'm seeing some marks on the screen around that data for this report was gathered during October to March. So we know the data collection window that addresses one of the look-fors. Okay. Does somebody want to come off mute and share what they circled or maybe what they identified and why? I see some folks are underlining or circling the part about email correspondence was issued to partner universities, again, telling us a little bit about the activities and how progress was made towards that goal of recruiting participants. See, someone underlined based on university feedback. Okay. So again, we get a little bit of insight there about how data was collected, how progress was made, how what those numbers for that project measure represent. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and clear drawing. So I'm going to ask you to hold off on drawing. We've got another example. Thank you for playing along with that one. Here's another one. I'm going to give you just a couple minutes of quiet time to read, and feel free to use that annotation feature again, or if you can't find those or it's not working for you, you can always type in the chat box, or you can come off mute and share with us what piece you feel addresses those look-fors. What do you see in this explanation of progress that provides some detail about those reported numbers, or maybe explains how that data is collected and compiled for reporting? See some stars there. So there's some details about how participants were counted. It tells us about the reported numbers. We don't have the actual chart to see what the numbers were, but we can see that in this explanation of progress, there's some detail that tell us a little bit about each year and how that was reported. Oh, and I love that somebody circled that 2B. Yes, that's a small but nice detail for your reviewers, right? Oftentimes that explanation of progress is speaking to more than one project measure in the project status chart. If that's the case, that's totally fine. And little indicators like that, like listing them so that they have the same number as what appears in the table, super helpful for the reviewer. So we know that it's clearly linked to that specific measure, and you're not making your reviewer guess. Thank you, Bonnie. Yes, gives clear quantitative numbers of progress. Okay. All right. Again, thank you for playing along with this. I wish we had time for more examples, because we do have some examples of some really good explanation of progress, but I'm going to go ahead and clear those drawings and keep this moving along, because I am also keeping an eye on the clock as well. Any final questions about that section A before we move on to section B?
Tracy, I'll probably come back to that when we get to section C, but just in the
very
additional
good.
info, but
Yep.
thanks.
Excellent. All right. Okay, so let's continue our walkthrough, and we'll go through the reporting form by running through section B, as well as some optional reporting tools that we've created for you. All right. So, and this section B is where you will provide a narrative account of your spending for the entire grant period. This section, you're going to get a little more room. This section will expand as you type into the form. So a few tips, ideally, again, to help make it easy on your reviewer and to help make it organized. In truth, things like these help me as a writer too. Organizing the section by budget category. That makes it really easy for your reviewer to connect the text with the numbers and the categories that are reported in your budget form. It also helps you to make sure that you're not skipping or leaving out any important information. Again, this, for those of you who are veterans, you know this. It's really helpful to craft this narrative in a separate document and then copy it and paste it into G5 once you have it fully written, so that it doesn't accidentally time out on you while you're crafting that narrative. So here are some reminders about what you need to report in your budget sections. So in your forms, you should be reporting the funds that have been expended. I'm careful my terms. Even if it's not yet reflected in G5 through the last day of the reporting period. The reporting periods for each grantee cohort are on the screen for you. This is an example. This is why we often recommend maintaining your own tracking of expenses, in addition to what your fiscal office does, so that you can be monitoring and keep an eye on those reports, so that if you know something's been spent or an expense is coming down, that you know that for when it comes to reporting time. Sometimes it can take a while for those fiscal offices to post and draw down expenses, even when you know they've been obligated. Other information that we want you to include in the budget section are the frequency of those G5 drawdowns. If drawdowns, if applicable, why drawdowns didn't happen. At least once a quarter is what we're hoping to see, at least once a quarter. And what you did to try to remedy that situation, and how you tracked expenditures independent of your budget office. You'll also want to describe any challenges that you faced due to the pandemic or otherwise, in terms of implementation or getting the grant off the ground. You'll also want to speak to any carryover funds or budget cuts that you may have experienced. All of those things are to be included in your budget narrative.
So Tracy, I'm going to say a little bit more here quickly about the carryover. So two things. And first, I'm going to address the FY18 cohort and share that when you're giving a narrative in your budget section and talking about carryover, you should be mindful of two things. One is that you're explaining probably the need to use, to the extent you need to use, any carryover for any individuals who continue to be delayed in their training, meaning that you anticipate some of your individuals participants needing to still continue training in year 5. So when you're talking about needing additional carryover funds to do that, be really clear about the need for those training costs, right? That training stipend line. That's different from also asking, for example, for those participants that you've exited with completion, saying, hey, I've got carryover in my contract line, in some other direct cost lines, even salary line, maybe supplies, et cetera, because we've had some delays in induction and we expect to make up and complete those induction activities in year 5. And therefore, we're going to need those direct cost funds for that. So being really clear about the purpose, because there are very discrete, right, uses. And technically by year 5, for the most part, you should be in that induction service phase. I won't go into, we've already sort of addressed ad nauseum the inevitability of some delays because of COVID and other challenges. But for the most part, moving into that induction phase and the need for those carryovers. So expecting that you need to make up induction activities to the extent that's necessary is very helpful to explain. Now for FY21 grantees, you're going to probably be getting by the end of the week, probably all of you, an email from me that is going to say you have a large available balance. We already know, because we've had post-award calls, and with most of you, I've had other calls and discussions. We know you're going to have a large available balance because you have none to few recruits as of today. And it's quite possible that some of you could have no recruits as of the due date of this coming APR. So this is where things like, I'm going to go back to what Tracy talked about earlier in section A, in the explanation of progress, particularly under the recruitment project measure. You're giving ample detail about, one, why you didn't, what were the challenges. So I know I've talked with many of you or all of you at different points about timing, of course, is some of that, but it's also challenges in just finding recruits, because I'm hearing that from more and more of you today, real time, right? As you're moving into the summer months in anticipation for either summer or fall registration. So it's talking about those challenges, and Tracy will get to this when we get to section C of, don't let that, if there's a character limit in that explanation of progress section, don't let that stop you from being comprehensive about your response. You know, continue any narrative on those issues into section C. But I raise that because you're talking about why, right? I'm going to know the why after I read section A when I get to budget and I see a really large training stipend line budget, which I would expect to see. And then you're going to tell me in your budget section why you're going to ask for carryover, i.e. probably all of those funds, right? As year 1 grantee, you're going to still ask for all of those training funds, and you're going to tell me why. You're going to tell me because you expect to be able to meet your target in year 2. And as much detail as you can provide in that section. And I don't need you to get into the programmatic and the strategies in the budget section, just that here's what we plan to do. We do plan to recruit this many. The why and how is really in that section C, when you talk about what's coming next. And so I know for many of you, the recruitment piece, it might continue into the rest of the budget period, but it might very well go into the following budget period. And I think the reality is of this timing, which is very unfortunate, the timing of our APRs. I will say, especially for year 1 grantees, you can anticipate that probably the beginning of June, I am very likely to follow up with each of you by phone and have conversations. All right, 2 months later, where are we really, right? And have a quick check-in. And that will be an opportunity for you to course correct if there's a need to course correct your projections in the APR. So I say that I'd love as much detail as you can give It makes it a lot easier for me to know and prioritize who I need to reach out to first. But again, you can expect that I'm going to reach out to you in June, in probably early June, to see where you are. And to see how, to what extent there's a gap in terms of what you explained in your APR and where you really are at that point in time. Okay. Thanks, Tracy.
Of course, of course. I wasn't sure if you also wanted to weigh in on the slide as well.
Yeah, so the large available balances I just mentioned, everybody's going to get a notification probably. That's just where you are when we're talking about the FY21 cohort. FY18, many of you got that notification earlier last month. And you may continue to get those monthly, because I'm going to try to give monthly updates to folks so that you're aware, because I know sometimes you guys aren't always aware either of where your budget office is in the drawdown process. But I also call that to your attention because I expect if you got a large available balance email, you're going to speak to that. So, and you might be doing it through the means through the different indicators we just talked about. But if there are other issues, and Tracy raised this too, delay in personnel hiring, whatever that is, that you're going to talk about that. Carmelita, you asked, would you consider the budget template form to be fairly self-explanatory? No, I don't. There are lots of reasons. All of you and your respective projects are very different. And so I'll be very frank, Carmelita, one of the reasons it does tend to be self-explanatory for you is because I talk to you often, meaning you reach out to me often and you give me a lot of updates often. Many of you don't. And it doesn't mean that I think that you're not doing anything, but because you don't, and if you are one of those and you know who you are, if maybe I've spoken to you once this year, I would expect to see a lot of detail in the APR to help explain where you are in the work. And I think some of the examples we just shared, and I think Tracy, when we send out the actual slide deck, keeping those other examples in, I think would still be helpful. We're not asking for pages and pages, but those examples you just saw, they give a lot of context and a lot of better understanding for how and why you might be in the position that you're in. So I don't think it takes too much more detail, but it takes more than just a line or two that's simply repeating the fact that I can gather from the quantitative data, right? So it's really sort of answering those why or why not and how. So why did you do this or why did you not? And how? How did this happen? And really, how are you going to fix it, right? So how are you going to remedy this situation and try to get back on track? What are those steps that you're taking? And I've spoken to almost all of you about the expectation, particularly again, the 21 grantees. I would want to see ample detail about what are you doing now? What have you been doing for the last 6 months to really, show a level of effort around preparing and readying or even doing the recruitment for this next year. So that's what I'd want to see reflected in that work to show, again, demonstrating substantial progress. You're moving and working toward achieving those objectives of your grant. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Okay, Tracy.
Thank you. Yeah, and I see we have a question in the chat box too, asking about clarification about expenditures reflected in G5. And yes, on the cover page, we did say that in that little line about in that item about the budget, that you will include that number should match what has been drawn down from G5. In this section, in section B, we get into a little bit more nuanced, detailed information. And so even if you have expended or obligated funds that are not yet reflected in G5, you're going to tell us about that here in this section. I hope that helps. Okay, so somebody mentioned the optional budget reporting form. And so I have a screenshot of that up on the screen for you right now. We have a form that we highly encourage you to use. Includes all of the information that is required for your annual performance report. By using it, you'll be sure to have all the information that we need to look at your report. And I see Yolani's got those going up in the chat box right now. You can use your own form, but again, we highly encourage you to use this template. Just be sure that if you do use your own form, that it contains all of the information that we've included here in this template. And I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail. We do have one for both the fiscal year 2021 as well as the fiscal year 2018 cohort, because your due dates are a little bit differently, and those are reflected in the in each of the forms. So on the screen now, you actually see the highlighted cells where you will enter information. At the top of the screen, you see your grantee name, award, and project director. We always need that information so that we know whose information we're looking at. For your annual performance reports, you do not need to provide those individual line items. You're only reporting on the overall budget category totals. So with these templates that we've posted into the chat box, you won't need to add any line items there. Okay. For each category, I'm going to just briefly touch on each of these columns now. But for each category of budget, you'll provide your approved budget, which is the most recently approved budget, and any carryover from the 2020, 2021, all right, for your fiscal year 18 cohorts, any carryover. The next column are funds that have been drawn down from G5, those expenditures which you've encumbered and actually drawn down from G5 in the reporting period, and that reporting period appears here in that the gray row right below it. Next, you'll enter in expenditures not yet drawn down from G5, funds that are. Sorry, did I get that mixed up? I think I skipped one. Approved budget. All right, and any carryover funds drawn down from G5, they're actually drawn down from G5 in the reporting period. The third column here is expenditures not yet drawn down from G5. Those are the funds that are obligated but not yet reflected in G5. This column, funds available, will auto-calculate based on what you've entered into these columns here. So you don't have to do any math or any figuring. That number will auto-calculate for you. The next column is one of two text-based columns where we're asking for a bit of narrative information. This one is about rationale for available funds, which Angela has spoken to a little bit. Very important to enter some text that explains why some available funds are remaining at this stage and how you plan to expend those dollars in the remaining grant year. The next column over is a number, and then this is the anticipated to be spent by September 30th. That should say 2022, I think. By the end of this grant period. Okay. And then the next column over is the amount estimated, the estimated amount that will be remaining at the end of the year. Again, that column that's in white will auto-calculate, so we don't have to do any math or configuring. That'll automatically appear. And then the final column is that, again, a narrative text piece where you can explain how you intend to use any remaining funds. Okay. Section C. So we've talked about some narrative pieces that appear in several different places. You'll be providing some narrative in the executive summary. You have a limited space in section A to provide that explanation of progress. In section B, we want you to include a budget narrative, but all of those have some limitations on how much text you can enter. So if there's additional information for any of those things that doesn't fit, you can put that here into section C. This is where you get to include all that information that didn't fit into those previous sections, as well as additional information that maybe didn't have a home someplace else, but you want to include some information about your project, some photos or student work samples or news clippings or accolades from other organizations and agencies. Section C is where you get to include that information.
Tracy, just for time, I'm going to ask you to leave it on this slide, and I want to talk about on the other slide, on the next one.
Yep.
With the narrative. I'm going to leave that up. People can look at that while I kind of talk about some more specific examples specific to PD about things you might want to include in section C. You guys have been offering a lot of great feedback over office hours, over the talking circle Q&A, about different issues that have come up and that have impacted your budget, you know, positive or negative. And so I'm just going to share a couple of examples based on some of those conversations I've had with you all. And one is, you know, we've had some examples where, and I think, Bonnie, I think you shared this just last week, of, you know, it turns out you have resources that have been made available to you participants that resulted in you not needing as much as you originally needed. So it doesn't mean that I'm looking to take away those funds, but I would have every expectation that in talking about likely carryover, you're talking about how you want to repurpose those funds, right? Conversely, I've heard from people, well, especially our 2018 cohort, hey, I had somebody who left and they've decided to come back and I still have funds, training funds, and I'd like to be able to help them finish. You know, there have been a couple of cases of that. I'd want you to explain that as well, because that's going to speak to, you know, wanting to keep some of that carryover into year 5, where maybe somebody originally exited without completion and is coming back to be able to finish on time as part of the project period. So there could be any number of those sort of just-in-time issues that arise that result in you needing to explain a little bit more about, you know, why do you suddenly need those carryover funds that I might be looking, frankly, to cut, especially for our year 5 grantees where you don't have as much time so left in your project period. So if there is an expectation that you need those funds, you've got to be really clear about providing that rationale for why. With the FY21s, it's a lot more about give me some detail on what you expect to be doing to get to where you really needed to be this year, right? So, and I know a lot of that was timing for many of you in terms of recruitment. But I also heard, and I appreciated the honesty about the challenges in recruiting at this time. You know, we're not through the impact of the pandemic, and we won't be for some time, as we all know. And so I understand that there will be those ongoing challenges, but I would ask you to speak to that and speak to what you're trying to do to remedy those issues. And again, if you've had to make course corrections, please also be very clear where there have been you know, expectations for salaried personnel that have been delayed because of hiring issues, any other issues like that, or, you know, changes to contracts, et cetera. That will be really important to reflect. And if you need section C to do that, use that space there. Partnerships. I would love to hear about partnerships. Many of you have MOUs in place. Many of you have stated partnerships in your applications with respective LEAs that are qualifying places of employment. I'd love to hear more about what is happening with those partnerships. So if there's something to share, we'd love to see that. Anything else there, Tracy, or are we good?
Good. We do have a couple of examples of how different grantees have used section C, but maybe just being mindful of people's time, we'll continue through, and I can come back to these at the end if you're able to stay on and want to see the examples. But we'll also make sure to post the full recording into our YouTube page. So in case you don't get to see the examples, they'll be in the recording as well.
I'll just say briefly, most of you are 21s are also the 18s, and we'll say this, there's never a guarantee, right, of funding. It's all subject to appropriations and passage most of the time, and we've not failed that yet. We expect you to be timely. That's really critical. And I will say for the FY21 cohort, it's very, very critical that you're on time. Why? Because you have a much earlier project period cycle than the FY18 cohort, meaning August 3rd is the new project period. And so any delays to your submission could have impact. So make sure that the report is submitted on time. Of course, I'll be in touch about carryover requests. And as I mentioned, I will likely be doing a lot of outreach end of May, early June. And that's less about, I'll probably have things read long before then, but I'll want to wait till that point when, more time has passed and I can get some more real-time data to inform any Ncc recommendations. If you decide you don't want to add a lot of information and provide a lot of data, understand this. I take a lot of your whys and hows and incorporate that into my recommendations for why I'm advocating for funding for you. That ultimately I don't get to decide. It's the secretary's office. So really understanding that your ability to rationalize the need for carryover, the need for a new funding, it's really dependent on you to provide that information. And you guys have been really great about that by and large. I think for our FY21s, it's a bit tougher. So anything that you can provide about why and how is going to be really important. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so heading into the home stretch here, we want to make sure that you get a look at those due dates and know when G5 will open for your reporting. Again, you may want to mark your calendars, or maybe you already know that for our 2018 cohort, G5 opened at the end of January. And for the 21 cohort, G5 opened as of the end of February, so that you can start to get in there and entering information. Keeping in mind that really only the project director of record in G5 can submit that report. So if you have others who are helping, that's great, but only the official project director actually has access to G5 to submit that report. And just a reminder too, that G5 is not going to accept any reports after not 1 second after those due dates, 4:30 p.m. Eastern time. You won't be able to get back in there to after that reporting deadline to do any revisions. So be sure that you finalize and submit your report. Don't leave it in draft form. Here's those final due dates just to drive it home one last time. And I know, oops, sorry. Just a quick heads up about some further technical assistance opportunities between now and those due dates. We do have some upcoming talking circles where you can get some questions asked, hopefully get some answers, and learn from each other, as well as some office hours, that informal drop-in time where you can kind of come and go as needed to get access to your program officer and get questions answered there. Olani's also going to drop the link to this to be able to book some individual coaching appointments. If you have specific questions to your grant that you need answers, you need to talk through something with someone on your technical assistance team, you can click that link and schedule some time. So I'm going to go ahead. We always conclude these sessions with an in-session poll. So we'll put that up on the screen just in case you do have to leave us at the bottom of the hour, you can take a few minutes, just a minute now to fill out those 7 questions. I promise it'll be super fast. If you have any questions, we'll stay on to answer any questions, but we also want to let you know that the project directors meeting is on the radar for May. Mark your calendars. This is just a reminder that all project directors are required to attend per the terms of your grant. That is a grant requirement. We're going to be holding this meeting virtually again this year. And we're celebrating, this is so cool, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Office of Indian Education's establishment. So very special year, 2022. We look forward to having you all at the project directors meeting. Here is some contact information just in case you need to get a hold of Angela or somebody on the technical assistance team. Also, for ease of reference, we've included that PDCS information on there as well. I see we're getting some responses to the poll, so please do that before you sign off today. We'll stay on now for any questions. And I'm also going to take a minute to share those examples of section C, just in case anybody's interested in sticking around for that.
And Tracy, while you're pulling that up, let me just mention, so Tracy just shared with you all the project directors meeting date. Just a reminder in case you hadn't participated in any of the other events before now, the talking circles or office hours, it is virtual. So because it is virtual, yes, please repurpose your travel funds for project director meeting for this year in that budget in your APR. Okay, those can be shifted to any other purpose needed for your program. So just a quick FYI on that. Thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, thank you.
And Cheryl, yes, this is recorded and it will be posted on our TA site.
Okay, so if you are able to hang around, great. If you're not, we'll make sure that this section is of the recording is also posted. But we did want to go ahead and share some examples of some great uses of how your fellow grantees have made use of your section C. So the first example that you see on the screen here, you see it's very clearly labeled. We have success stories. We have some challenges that are spoken to. We also have some information about the status of partnerships and key personnel changes. All this is information that we're interested in learning. Section C is the appropriate place to use it. It's clearly labeled so we know what we're reading about and how it pertains to the report.
And I would just add, Tracy, as fabulous as everybody is, I bet you they did this outside of G5 before having to go in and enter it, because it's a lot of info. They probably didn't do it in the 15 minutes, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, not if you're a writer like me, it takes some time. Here's a little bit of a different example. In this example, this is an excerpt from a section C that a grantee submitted. This person included some highlights that included some pictures from some actual events that took place. If we scroll down, we see some flyers and event information, some descriptions of what some of those events what they looked like or what they consisted of. Here we see another one, examples from some pamphlets or flyers related to those, a welcome letter, program materials, schedules of different cohort meetings throughout the year. So 2 different examples, both great uses of section C that gives us a little bit more insight and peek into your program. So you can use it to capture anything that didn't fit in those previous sections, as well as anything else that you think we should know about or that you want to highlight that shows all the great work that you're doing. sometimes some of my favorite sections to read, to be honest.
And I would add, Tracy, I just want to mention to the grantees, thanks to the support from Synergy. Over this next year, I anticipate being able to take some of that content and being able to feature it the way we've been doing on our OIE program pages. As some of you have been sending pictures of your graduates, some of the really good news, we've been able to feature that. And so I certainly welcome you guys to add those pieces in your narrative. And I agree, Tracy, it is the best part of the APR. So thank you all. I know that was a really long one, but I hope it was helpful.
Yes, and thank you everybody for responding to the poll. Best wishes on your APR season. Please feel free to reach out with your questions, concerns along the way. Thank you.